On April 13th, 2009, a man named Andrew Hussey started a webcomic called Homestuck. It was the fourth webcomic he'd made on his website, MS Paint Adventures, and by far his most ambitious. Unlike previous works that were mainly in your typical webcomic format with a few variations here and there, Homestuck introduced tons of complex Flash animations, fully fleshed out Flash games, and a massive assortment of music provided by many artists. One in particular making quite a name for himself in recent years. At the time, it was really one of the first of its kind. However, instead of the webcomic becoming solely known for all the weird and wild characteristics it had, for many, Homestuck became incredibly infamous for something completely outside its control, the fandom. Hell, even I remember that whenever people would talk about bad fandoms, as it were, around 6 or so years ago, Homestuck would always end up being mentioned in some form or fashion. The question is, how did it all get to that point? And is it even deserving of it? Though I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, without further ado, let me tell you about Homestuck. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and welcome to the Season 2 finale of the Fandom Files, the most inconsistent series on the internet where we dive into all the good and bad found within each and every fandom. And in making such a massive video like this video was actually sponsored by Dollar Shave Club. More information at the end of the video about that. So with this episode being the first Fandom Files where I actually seriously got into the fandom while going through the source material, I've said it before, but I binge read the entire webcomic in 9 days. Needless to say, we have a lot to cover. So to truly cover the Homestuck fandom in its entirety, we have to start from the very beginning, because before Homestuck was even remotely conceived, the group of people that would eventually form its fandom were simply fans of the comics Hussey put on MS Paint Adventures. And if we want to go even farther back, the webcomics he'd put on Team Special Olympics and the Penny Arcade forums. Now there really isn't much to touch on here, since like many other small fandoms, they didn't really have any major events whatsoever to speak of, but what does make them important is their actual input in the webcomics put on the site. You see, in general, all the webcomics on MS Paint Adventures are parodies of interactive adventure games, where you'd input a command to influence the path of the story. Well, instead of actually inputting commands, what made these webcomics really unique is on the official forums for the website, people would suggest a variety of commands to put into the webcomic, with Hussey picking the ones he liked the most. At one point, you could even donate money for fully fleshed out custom commands. Thus, as a result, from the very beginning, Hussey's webcomics and the fandoms they developed were practically one and the same. Plus, with the release of Problem Sleuth, the first MSPA webcomic Hussey gave a proper ending to, these webcomics really began to develop a relatively small but solid fanbase. So in turn, with MS Paint Adventures beginning to grow a fandom, Homestuck was conceived, a webcomic that took everything Hussey had learned from making the past 3 and improving on it massively. At first, it was all quite similar to everything else on the website, with Hussey allowing readers to input their own commands through the forums. But once fans began to produce music for the webcomic, the completely separate music forums would be created, only increasing the already massive interactivity between Homestuck and its fandom. And while other factors would come into play within the following years, in its early days, what really drove the Homestuck fandom to grow faster than the others would be how greatly Fanworks were encouraged throughout the community, though we'll expand on that later. By now, we've gone ahead quite a few months into the beginning of 2010. At this point, Homestuck had already come quite a ways, with it just starting its 4th act so far, an act that would truly start to see Homestuck blow up like never before. I mean, just take the way Act 4 started. Homestuck had already gotten all sorts of Flash pages under its belt, from animations to full-on minigames, but the explorable game simply called Act 4 would only be the beginning of many even more complex Flash games that follow it. But unfortunately, to the dismay of many, while it was definitely great that the webcomic was advancing to new heights, with it came the end of some people's favorite aspect about the whole MSPA experience, the suggestion boxes. Now this happened due to a variety of factors. You see, back when Homestuck Homestuck's following was made up mostly of fans picked up from Hussey's other works like Problem Sleuth, the suggestion box was fairly manageable, with the man himself being able to use it with ease. But as the webcomic slowly but surely grew a following much larger than anything Hussey had ever experienced before, it became increasingly harder to implement contributions from the audience like he once did, due to all of it starting to border on chaotic at times. Plus, aside from that, Hussey had already been wanting to take more or less full control over Homestuck, with him hinting at using the suggestion boxes less for a while. Of course, regardless, this would still mark the first real controversial event to happen within the fandom, with even more just around the corner, as only 1 month later, we'd get to April 2010, a month that would prove to be one of the most eventful yet for both Homestuck and its fandom. Like, whereas beforehand the fandom had been growing at a pretty steady pace, only starting to pick up recently, once Flash animations like Descend were released, many people who hadn't even read Homestuck at all would end up coming across it due to how complex and out of the ordinary the animations were. Not to mention, in this same month, we'd also get Jack Ascend, a Flash that, at least for me, is still a personal favorite, especially considering the song that goes with it. But speaking of music, April would also be host to Homestuck's second notable piece of controversy, though comparatively, it wouldn't end up being that significant in the long run, so I'll try to cover it as quickly as possible. Enter Bill Bolin, a member of the ever-growing music team Hussey had built up over the course of Homestuck. Up until April, he'd made some pretty solid tracks, with quite a few animations made specifically to sync up with them. But one day, he snapped. Let me set the stage here. You see, on the special music forums, when the people Hussey had selected to be on the team would put up a finished product, they'd put it in a specific thread meant for tracks that were fair game to be used in the webcomic or put into the albums. Now, Bolin clearly knew this, and there really isn't an explanation I can find out there as to why he'd do what he did. But what ended up happening is, for some unknown reason, Bolin decided it would be a good idea to drop some incomplete songs he'd made for fun in the thread meant specifically for completed songs. Why he didn't make a separate thread? Who knows? It may have all been an accident, honestly. But to Bolin's surprise, when Hussey stumbled upon these little demo songs, he actually liked them and thought it would be a good idea to pleasantly surprise Bolin by putting them in the webcomic. Needless to say, this would have the opposite result, because instead of working out this simple misunderstanding with Hussey like anyone else would, Bolin would proceed to have a massive tantrum in a thread open for the entire MSPA forums to see, leading to him not only being kicked off the music team, but having all his songs used in Homestuck replaced completely. In the end, like I said, it wouldn't really have that much of an impact, but it was worth going over all the same, since from this point onward, things would only ramp up more and more. Anyways, all that aside, let's move 2 months ahead to the beginning of Act 5, Part 1, otherwise known as Hivebent, a Homestuck arc completely centered around everyone's favorite weird gray bug aliens, trolls. And with the coming of trolls came Homestuck's first real boom that completely changed the fandom forever. Since considering that Hivebent technically didn't require you to read previous acts to understand what was happening, it ended up being an easy point of entry for the droves of new fans interested in the series. But wait a second, where did all these new fans come from? I mean, hell, this is 2010 we're talking about here. Fandoms weren't exactly as prevalent of a thing back then as they are today. What other fandoms were there to feed into Homestuck? Well, there was really only one. Hetalia. Now, the relationship between Homestuck and Hetalia's fandom is definitely more on the complicated side, with them seemingly hating and loving each other at the same time. You see, by now, Hetalia had absolutely exploded into one of the biggest internet fandoms at the time period, and as they quickly spread to all corners of the internet, people who didn't care for the show quickly grew tired of them. So in turn, when word about a relatively new fandom with a shipping system more complex than anything ever before spread to the ears of Hetalia fans who'd grown tired of being hated by the entire internet, many decided it was the perfect time to jump ship. ship. Though ironically enough, as droves came in from Hitalia and other similar anime fandoms, Homestuck began to spread far past the forums it inhabited, slowly but surely spreading all throughout the internet, much like Hitalia had. And just like what happened to them, parts of the Hitalia fandom began to hate Homestuck for the exact same reason. However, let's take a pause here before things get too crazy, because I have a few things I feel I need to explain. Firstly, considering the majority of you have probably never touched Homestuck, what even are trolls exactly? Well, these are trolls. They're actually introduced pretty early on in the story as internet trolls, and time-traveling ones at that. Don't think about that bit too hard, it's for your own good. But they'd only end up being fully fleshed out and introduced here. You'd have such riveting characters like the Mad One, the Sad One, the RP Lawyer, the one with all the luck, the Dead One, the Homestuck Fandom, the Little Mermaid, Hot Topic, the Sweaty One, the one that deserves a hug, the one whose dialogue took me a solid 10 minutes to figure out what he was even saying, and Gamzee. Later on in the story, another 12 trolls would be thrown into the fray as well in the form of Dancestors, but for now, I'll leave things there. You see, above all the weird alien traits and powers they have, there's one specific thing that came alongside the introduction of trolls that would take the Homestuck fandom by storm: their romance. Oh boy, where do I even begin with this? So it's no secret that to the joy of some and dismay of others, shipping always ends up being a pretty large topic in most fandoms out there, some more than others. But when it came to the Homestuck fandom, with the introduction of troll romance, shipping took on a whole new light. Now I won't be able to give you guys a full explanation of this because, I mean hell, even when Hussey did it, originally it took several walls of text to explain it all. And on a side note here, I'm not even joking, if one of you could actually write out a detailed explanation of how troll romance works in the comments, I'll pin the first one I see. So okay, to summarize it all as broadly as I can, troll romance is characterized by the 4 quadrants, each representing a different form of romance. As a result, after Hivebend, Homestuck shipping was not limited to the typical kinds of pairings you'd expect to find in a fandom. It ended up having pairings involving all sorts of quadrants, mainly that of the flushed and pitch. And surprisingly enough, when compared to other fandoms that have any sort of focus on shipping, Homestuck is actually one of the less volatile ones, believe it or not, partially due to the fact that as a result of there being literally any type of pairing you could think of, involving any character you could think of, there ends up not being too much infighting, at least shipping-wise. Instead, what would really end up causing Homestuck's bad reputation was something entirely different, though we'll get to that in a bit. Fast forward quite a few months, and now we've arrived to 2011. By now, the Homestuck fandom had without a doubt become one of the largest fandoms ever, absolutely flooding the internet more so than even Hitalia did. And with it all originating from the once small and relatively quiet MSPA forums, it was safe to say that the fandom's population now numbered in the millions, with literally any type of fan content you could imagine being pumped out on tons of platforms. Plus somehow, against all the odds, even though the fandom had become this massive, there was still that tight-knit sense of community that you'd only expect to find in fandoms much smaller. The question is, how did Homestuck manage to keep this unreal pace of growth despite being a webcomic? Well, the answer was update culture, because from the very first page of the webcomic to its grand finale, with the exception of programming help, musical help, and artistic help when it came to the animations, Homestuck was all made by one guy alone, and as a result, updates would come out very sporadically. Normally, when looking at any other fandom that came close to Homestuck's size, whether it be a series or a game, naturally the fandom would grow when new content was released and shrink while there was none. Though with Homestuck, all of that was thrown right out the window, since due to updates coming selling out all the time. The hype train surrounding it only grew more intense. One day, you could get an update in the middle of the night solely consisting of a cherub child drawing awful yaoi to put on his actual DeviantArt account, and then a full 3 days later, you'd get a flash that'd kill off 8 characters in one fell swoop, sending the entire fandom into a chaotic frenzy. But wait, oops, never mind, and only a week later, that'd all be retconned. However, I'm going a bit too far ahead here. Going back to 2011, when the Homestuck fandom was just about bursting at the seams, Hussey began the first of many Homestuck pauses, where for a full month, no updates were posted. Of course, with this being the first time Homestuck had gone on any sort of hiatus for over 2 years at this point, the anticipation of the fandom reached absolutely unprecedented levels, with theories and speculations being thrown around more than usual. So when, after a full month, Hussey released a nearly 14-minute long flash animation jam-packed with amazing music, incredible visuals, and just about everything else you wouldn't expect from a webcomic, the entire fandom exploded. Though seeing as Hussey was already quite aware of how large his fandom had grown to be, he'd even taken precautions by having the flash be hosted by Newgrounds in an attempt to handle the truckloads of people that would soon flock to it. But even then, it still wouldn't be enough, because when Cascade was released on October 25th, 2011, so many people flocked to the website that, and I'm not exaggerating, on that single day, Hussey recorded over 1.2 million people trying to watch it at the same time, leading to it not only crashing the entirety of Newgrounds, but the actual Homestuck site, the MSPA forums, Mega Upload, and even Twitter and livestream for a brief period due to so many people streaming it and tweeting out links. Looking back on it and the state of the fandom at that time, the entire situation truly stands as a testament to how absolutely insane the Homestuck fandom was at its prime. And believe me, things would only get crazier. Taking a step back from the webcomic itself, there's one aspect of Homestuck that I can't neglect: its massive community of cosplayers. Since in all honesty, aside from the annoying minority that would either shove Homestuck in everyone's faces, or do other irksome stuff that gave people a bad impression of Homestuck in general, I'd say that the grand majority of people who couldn't stand Homestuck's fandom was due to its loud minority of rude, annoying, or just plain weird cosplayers. Of course, like always, the majority of Homestuck cosplayers were chill, nice people who just wanted to cosplay their favorite characters and meet other fans in the process. But oh boy, were the weird ones just some of the strangest you'd ever see. For starters, back in 2011 and 12, Homestuck was, to quote a friend of mine, baby's first fandom, as it were, for a lot of the people who went cosplaying, largely due to the majority of fans who came from Italia being around the age of 12 and 13. So as a result, not only had many of them never been to a convention period, they'd also never cosplayed before, leading to a lot of the good-natured cosplayers ending up in as much trouble as the bad ones. I mean, just take the people who'd cosplay trolls for example. While for most, it's pretty common knowledge that if you ever use body paint for a cosplay period, you have to seal the paint, many of these kids just flat out didn't know that, and would end up absolutely wrecking havoc on the conventions they went to. It's a bit funny now, looking back on it all, what with convention centers having gray smudges everywhere and people coming out of them looking like they were just in an art studio that only allowed gray paint after the Homestucks blew through. But it became a pretty big serious problem, with many handcrafted cosplays being totally ruined. Hell, in 2011, if you ever went to a convention that had a ban on body paint, then you'd best be sure Homestuck was related in some form or fashion. There's a reason Homestuck seemingly has an absolutely massive library of horror stories when it comes to its cosplayers. Half of them didn't even know better. And when they did know better, like with the infamous Sharpie bath of 2011, well, I just say they were kind of dumb to begin with. Like, aside from the whole body paint fiasco, another major problem most people had with these particular Homestuck cosplayers would be their behavior, as in an attempt to be in character, they would end up doing a lot of crazy stuff. stuff. I mean, considering the trolls were already kind of just exaggerated personas of how internet trolls act online, things wouldn't end well. For example, take certain people who would cosplay Terezi, a blind character who in the webcomic was able to see through her sense of smell and taste. Of course, in the webcomic, this was used as a running gag of sorts, with her doing bizarre stuff like licking the screen of her computer to read chat logs and such. Though again, that's all it was, a gag, not something you'd actually do in real life, much less in social situations. But when you throw these young, immature cosplayers into the mix, well, let's just say a lot of things were licked, including people. Or how about when these immature cosplayers would try to do Gamzee, and instead of, you know, not annoying everyone including their fellow Homestuck cosplayers, would run around the convention honking a horn. But unfortunately, sometimes the people who do this crap weren't even kids at all. Take the time a Cardcat cosplayer was literally pelted with metal buckets to the point of bleeding by a small group of cosplayers just because of a single scene in the webcomic. And after they were first banned from the meetup and later asked why they did it, their only response was, "We were just being in character." So on that note, let me go on a mini tangent here before we move on from this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being in character when you're cosplaying. If anything, that can be half the fun. But when being in character involves you adversely affecting those around you, or even physically harming someone, please use your common sense and restrain yourself. Okay, tangent over. So besides the cosplayers who didn't seal their paint, or made absolute fools of themselves and the fandom by acting in character, with a fandom as large and constantly growing like Homestuck, in turn, its amount of bad eggs, while still very small in comparison to the rest of the fandom, would still be pretty sizable, leading to such things like groups larger than 20 solely comprised of these aforementioned bad eggs, absolutely ruining small conventions for people who knew nothing about Homestuck by treating them rudely, and in one story I found, even picking fights. Though by far, as awful as people like that were, probably the best example of how terrible these people could get has video evidence. Now I'm going to censor certain parts of this video as the entire thing gets legitimately vile, and coming from someone who's seen some of the worst stuff the internet has to offer, even I had a hard time getting through this video. So to make up for it, let me do my best to explain what's exactly happening here. Basically, in Homestuck, to the troll race specifically, buckets have quite a large significance. You see, whereas to us, buckets are used for what you'd expect, holding water and such, to trolls, they have an integral role in the reproduction of their entire species. Mainly since before they're taken to the massive mother grub that is solely responsible for giving birth to every troll ever, trolls have to deposit their genetic material into the buckets. I won't go more into detail since that could lead to risky territory, but keeping that in mind, in this video, much like those people who were being in character, this group of Homestuck cosplayers were collectively spitting into a bucket as part of a joke of theirs that they were creating Nick Cage. All the while, other people around them in the restaurant were trying to eat and mind their own business. Now, I don't think I even need to explain that this does not represent the Homestuck fandom in the slightest. I mean, even when I was younger, I would never do something this disgusting. And if anyone watching this somehow would, here's my sage advice. Don't. Just don't. You know what? I'm gonna make that a please don't. Because even if you don't care, all you're doing is further alienating the Homestuck fandom from just about everyone else. And whether you like it or not, the fandom will distance itself from you as well. Also, on a side note, speaking of being shunned, just because you don't like a certain character and someone else does, don't alienate or insult that person just because they do. Hell, I've even seen this happen myself with people who are fans of Gamzee. But anyways, all that aside, let's dive back into it. now that we've gone over the main reason that the Homestuck fandom has such a bad reputation, let's continue telling its story because we've got quite a bit left to go over. With 2011 behind us, now we're in 2012, a year that's regarded by many to be the peak of the Homestuck fandom, because with Cascade showing the internet that while Homestuck is still a tale about a boy and his friends and the game they play together, clearly it goes far deeper than that. So with the fandom now growing at an explosive pace, like 2011, 2012 would also be quite the eventful year, as with Hussey beginning to ramp up the ongoing trend of pauses with 3 in 2012, he'd soon drop something absolutely massive and unprecedented on the fandom, the Homestuck adventure game Kickstarter. Started back when Kickstarter was only 3 years old, the Homestuck adventure game was just about as vague as you could get, with the entire thing being more of an idea than anything. But regardless, it was also a genius idea, since considering the webcomic was already a massive parody of adventure games, an actual Homestuck adventure game was every Homestuck fan's dream. And in turn, once the funding period was over, with the original goal being $700,000, this Kickstarter managed to amass a whopping $2,485,506, with even more being donated through PayPal. Needless to say, the Kickstarter was such a massive success that it sent waves throughout the entire internet, causing yet even more people to become interested in Homestuck. However, unfortunately, in an ironic twist of fate, this Kickstarter and the development hell that follow it would end up being the main catalyst of why the Homestuck fandom began to dwindle. Though since we're still in 2012, that'll have to wait, because, and I honestly just can't not mention this, in 2012, Homestuck had become so widespread and popular that even the actor Dante Bosco, an actor who among other roles played the character Rufio in Hook, a character that's referenced multiple times in Homestuck, ended up not only joining the fandom, but getting into the webcomic himself, to interesting results. Though aside from that madness, now we're in 2013, the year that marked the end of Homestuck's semi-consistent updates, aside from the previous pauses. We start with the year 4 Megapause, a pause that wouldn't be so bad compared to what was to come, only lasting 2 months. In this pause's case, it was mainly so Hussey could work on the game, plan out future acts, work on the Homestuck books that were coming out at the time, and so he could attend conventions. While this wouldn't really sway the fandom too much given it was only 2 months, a couple would begin to shift their focus to some other rapidly growing fandoms at the time. But only a couple months after the Megapause, there was the Gigapause, the largest test of loyalty period for the Homestuck fandom, lasting an entire year. Though why did this happen? It was understandable before, what with Hussey either working on massive flash animations or other Homestuck related things. But in reality, part of the reason the Gigapause went on for so long isn't even Hussey's fault. Enter the Odd Gentlemen, the game developers that Hussey chose to make what would eventually become Hiveswap. Originally, Hussey had put a lot of faith in them, and believed they were the perfect people to get the job done, but unfortunately, all they would ever give in return was a handful of legal troubles. And while I can't explain what happened exactly due to everything we know right now not being 100% confirmed, let's just say there's a pretty good chance the Odd Gentlemen actually took money from the Homestuck Kickstarter to use in their other projects, all the while barely doing any work on Hiveswap itself. As a result, instead of the Gigapause being much shorter like Hussey intended, this year-long hiatus was spent mainly by Hussey trying his best to sort out the Odd Gentleman's incompetence, only to give up entirely and move development in-house to What Pumpkin. So as you'd expect, whereas the Homestuck fandom was only growing faster and faster every year, once the Gigapause dropped and continued to go on all the way until October 2014, while Homestuck was still arguably the largest fandom around, slowly but surely more people were losing interest and moving on to other fandoms. And while there would be some Homestuck related things to come out around this time, like Namco High, a dating sim that among other things did feature a couple Homestuck characters, Paradox Space would also come out around this time, a side project to Homestuck that through showcasing little comics featuring hypothetical situations in the Homestuck universe, did keep keep the fandom tied over pretty well until the end of the Gigapause, not to mention it actually had a set schedule of 1 page per weekday. So then, one excruciatingly long year later, Homestuck Giga unpaused, and the fandom exploded once more. Plus, with the Flash animation Game Over dropping only a little over a week later, what was once a waning fandom grasping for just about anything to keep itself alive was thrown into absolute mayhem due to the contents of Game Over. Content that I literally can't even allude to without somewhat spoiling anyone who hasn't gotten this far in the webcomic. And from this point on, events like these would become a cycle. Homestuck would go on a pause for work on Hiveswap or an animation-intensive Flash, unpause with a massive bombshell to drop on the fandom, continue on for a while, then go on yet another pause. For a while, this was just part of the Homestuck experience, and with Paradox Space going on an indefinite hiatus, or basically being cancelled, in 2015, the fandom would continue to dwindle even more. Now we're in late 2015. At this point, Homestuck was in the middle of, and I'm not making this up, Act 6, Intermission 5, with its fandom wavering more than ever before. You see, also in late 2015, one of the more famous Homestuck fans who'd composed many iconic tracks for the webcomic, Toby Fox, had completed his game Undertale, a game that'd soon grow an absolute behemoth of a fandom itself. So in turn, much like those Italians who jumped from their fandom to Homestuck, many Homestucks would jump from Homestuck to Undertale, drastically decreasing the amount of people whose main focus was Homestuck. Thus, as Homestuck continued on with multiple hiatuses spread here and there, we'd reach 2016 when right before Hussey would announce that Homestuck was actually going to end for real this time, the MSPA forums would be shut down indefinitely with no notice whatsoever to the fandom, making the already shaky fandom more wounded than ever before, with their cornerstone being permanently confiscated. But not all was bad. When Hussey dropped the largest Flash animation in Homestuck to date, Collide, in April, the remaining fandom combusted with excitement. Hell, even though I binge-read the entire webcomic, I still think Collide is my favorite out of all the animations throughout Homestuck, with its fight scenes being such a massive payoff for everything that happened so far. So after Collide, the Homestuck fandom was doing pretty good for itself overall. Many were excited for the Act 7 animation that would end the webcomic for good, and in general, sentiments were quite positive. Though then, only a couple days later, Act 7 dropped. Again, obviously I can't really describe it in the slightest, as I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but needless to say, it left the fandom wanting more. Because while Act 7 was the official ending to Homestuck, it also technically wasn't in a way, since with Hussey having already stated previously that Homestuck would receive an epilogue at some undetermined point in the future, even today, Homestuck technically still isn't over. Now, thankfully, everything didn't just flat out end with Act 7, as months later in October, we would end up getting more story with the Homestuck credits, but even then, the fandom didn't blow up about it like it did in the past. However, wait a second, believe it or not, the credits wouldn't be the end of it either, as after all of that, Homestuck would begin getting snap dates, which were literally updates to Homestuck, but through the official Homestuck Snapchat. So with those lasting through the end of 2016, we've now entered 2017. By now, the Homestuck fandom, while still having a presence online, had massively dispersed into other fandoms like it. Though wait a second, what about Hiveswap? Well, after being reworked 3 times and delayed once more, it actually came out, and considering how much of a nightmare its development had been, it turned out pretty well. Once again, while the fandom was pretty spread out at this point, things had become pretty positive again, with everything finally coming together as it were. Plus hey, wouldn't you look at that, Hiveswap Act 2 was slated for spring 2018, that's not even that far away. Though well, now we're here. In 2018, at least as of this recording, nothing that eventful has happened for the Homestuck fandom yet, as like you'd probably expect, Act 2 was delayed once more to the fandom's dismay, and just recently, Hiveswap's hiatus was put on another hiatus. so isn't that fun? If anything, seeing how nice Act 1 turned out, I just hope all these delays make Act 2 look just as good. And on the bright side, instead of leaving the fandom to shrivel up entirely, every other week we've been getting the Friend Sims. Mini visual novels as they were, where you become friends with each of the new trolls revealed previously in 2017. So well, now we're here. Looking back on it all, if you compare Homestuck to just about any other fandom that's blown up after it, it becomes really apparent that while overall some fandoms may surpass Homestuck through sheer numbers, there will never be another fandom movement quite like Homestuck. Sure, there will be many who overtake the internet like Homestuck did, but to thrive for so long and literally shape the way fandoms are nowadays, Homestuck was, in every sense of the term, the perfect storm. Hell, when the aforementioned update culture was at its peak, people had even developed update notifiers that would alert you when the Husk would bestow a new page of ham steak. And my god, when the fandom was exploding in 2012, 2 people paid $10,000 on the Kickstarter for Hussy to include their fan trolls in Homestuck for 1 frame, only for them to be killed off immediately. Plus, don't even get me started about the oceans worth of Fanworks people have made and continue to make. There is so much fan music, fan art, and even ongoing fan stories that if you compared it to any other fandom, it wouldn't even be fair. Like, just take the fan animation Rex Duodecim Angelus, where a ton of fans all came together to animate an absolutely incredible fight scene that even Hussy himself later said was canon. And there's so much more too. Songs like You Can't Fight the Homestuck and all the animations by Empty Feet really show how passionate this fandom can be. Not to mention, when the tidal wave that was Homestuck hit the con scene, even the very structure of conventions wouldn't be the same, with many rules, types of panels, and even meetups being directly influenced by Homestucks. In this case, for better or for worse. And well, with all that said, I only have one thing left to say. Oh god, here comes the part where he tries to get you all into Homestuck. Look, alright, okay, well, yeah, I may be going through a mini phase myself right now, having unintentionally fallen into the fandom, but at the same time, I'm also a pretty firm believer in the fact that it's not too late. Like, seriously, not only does Hiveswap have 3 more acts, but after Hiveswap, we'll be getting Haunt Switch, with it having yet another 4 acts. Sure, Homestuck may not be for everyone, especially if you don't enjoy the humor, but I say give it a chance. Believe it or not, when that one friend told you back in 2012 that it gets better, they were right. And I also realized that for many, it's kind of hard to enjoy Homestuck in the first place due to the bad experiences you've had in the past with its fandom. And believe me, I feel you. For a while, I was like that with Undertale and JoJo due to a variety of situations, but after letting all that garbage go, it's honestly way better to enjoy something instead of unconditionally hating it. And hey, at the very least, check out Homestuck's music when you have the chance, because coming from someone who was initially hooked due to the music, I guarantee you it's top quality stuff. So in the end, to say Homestuck was a phenomenon is an understatement. Sure, it had quite a few bad eggs, like all fandoms do, but it also had a massively positive impact on so many more people. And while there may never be anything like it ever again, it will without a doubt live on through the cherished memories of old fans and the excitement of new fans. But you know, there's one thing that Homestuck never answered. How did Dad Egbert, yes that's his actual name, manage to stay so clean and smooth throughout the entire webcomic? Well, that's because of Dollar Shave Club, the sponsor of this video. Though wait a second, why am I doing a Dollar Shave Club sponsorship? I clearly have a beard myself, and besides using razors to help trim it, I don't have any intentions of shaving it off right now. Well, that's because in reality, Dollar Shave Club isn't only for, well, shaving. If it comes to the bathroom, then they most likely have something for it. Whether it be when you're shaving, showering, going to the bathroom, styling your hair, and even brushing your teeth, Dollar Shave Club has you covered. So hey, if that sounds good to you, then go down to Dollar Shave Club/RPG Monger to get some of their great products today. If you're a new member, then you could get the Daily Essentials Starter Kit for only $5 and free shipping, coming packaged with the Executive Razor, trial-size versions of their shave butter, their body cleanser, and yes, the One Wipe Charlie's butt wipes. Plus, after getting the starter kit, replacements for things like the razors are only a couple dollars a month. So again, if that sounds like a good plan to you, then feel free to use the link on screen or down in the description. And remember, Dollar Shave Club is 100% guinea pig approved. Did I just want to include one of my guinea pig? Whoa. Did I just want to include one of my guinea pigs into this video? Yeah, but what are you gonna do about it? He's biting my shirt right now. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I'll give you here. You know what? Here. Now he's happy. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe, and today's cool thing of the day is, well, a secret. Go down into the description to find out what it is. You'll either thank me or despise me for it later. And for those coming back to this video after seeing it, yes, that was all made by Toby Fox. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic. What do you think about Homestuck? He just turned away.